The dying sun of Kalen cast long, weak shadows across the barren landscape. Dust clouds drifted aimlessly through the air, settling on the abandoned structures that dotted the horizon like tombstones. Once a vibrant world of lush vegetation and clear waters, Kalen had been reduced to a wasteland of muted colors and eerie silence. The ecological disaster had come slowly at first, then accelerated with devastating speed, water sources drying up, atmosphere growing toxic, native flora withering away. Now, only the most resilient or desperate life forms remained. Dr. Eris Thorne stood at the viewport of his observation station, recording the day's measurements with mechanical precision. Temperature, 3.2 degrees below seasonal average. Atmospheric toxicity, increased 0.7% since last week. Indigenous population sightings, none for 17 days. He spoke the data points into his recorder with a detached voice that betrayed no emotion, just as he had done every day for the past 3 years. The station, a utilitarian structure of metal and composite materials, stood in stark contrast to the organic architecture of the Kalen civilization it was built to study. Perched on a ridge overlooking what had once been a thriving settlement, it now served as a scientific outpost documenting extinction. Or, as the Earth Observation Corps euphemistically put it, monitoring planetary transition. Eris ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders from hunching over equipment all day. At 42, he felt decades older. His weathered face and perpetually furrowed brow made him look like a man who had seen too much, which was precisely the case. The isolation didn't bother him anymore. In fact, he preferred it this way, just him and his instruments, recording data, following protocols. Observe, never interfere. The Corps' prime directive was etched into his psyche as deeply as the scars on his heart. Night was falling when the proximity alarm chimed, a sound so unexpected that Eris nearly dropped his thermal scanner. He glanced at the security panel where a small red dot pulsed at the perimeter of the station's security ring. Movement. After weeks of nothing. Computer, enhance Sector 7, he commanded, his voice suddenly alert. The screen zoomed in, switching to thermal imaging. A heat signature moved slowly, erratically, toward the station. Not an animal, the gate was bipedal. A Kalen. Protocol dictated immediate reporting and lockdown procedures. No contact allowed under any circumstances. He knew this, had followed it religiously since the incident that had cost him everything 5 years ago. His finger hovered over the lockdown command, but something made him hesitate. The figure moved with such difficulty, stumbling, pausing, pressing forward with obvious effort. And there was something else, a smaller heat signature, held close to the larger one. Against every regulation, Eris grabbed his atmospheric mask and outdoor gear and headed for the airlock. Just to observe more closely, he told himself. Just to document. From the safety of the observation platform outside the main entrance, Eris watched the approaching figure through his binoculars. It was indeed a Kalen, tall and willowy despite being hunched over, with the characteristic pale blue skin now dulled by dust and hardship. A female, he realized as she came closer. Her large amber eyes reflected what little light remained in the dusk, giving them an unearthly glow. Her clothing, once perhaps decorative with the woven plant fibers the Kalens prized, hung in tatters around her emaciated frame. And in her arms, wrapped in scraps of fabric, she carried a child, an infant barely moving. When she reached the edge of the platform, she stopped, swaying slightly on her feet. She looked directly at Eris with eyes that held such profound desperation that he felt it like a physical blow. Her thin lips parted, and in halting, accented English, likely learned from monitoring Earth broadcasts, she spoke 6 words that shattered his careful detachment. My milk has dried up, human. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. My baby hasn't eaten for days. The infant in her arms made no sound. Only the slightest movement of the bundle indicated it was still alive. In that moment, memories crashed through Eris like a tidal wave. Sarah's face contorted with accusations. The inquiry board's condemning expressions. The hologram of the village he'd tried to help, reduced to ashes because of his interference, his arrogance in thinking he knew better than protocol. The faces of the dead. Observe, never interfere. But the Kayla mother took another step forward, her legs finally giving out as she collapsed to her knees, still clutching her baby protectively. "Please," she whispered, the universal word of desperation. Eris closed his eyes for one heartbeat, then two. When he opened them, he had already made his choice. He moved forward, helping the Kalan woman to her feet. "Come inside," he said quietly. Quickly, as the airlock doors sealed behind them, Eris knew he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Inside the station's sterile environment, the Kalan woman seemed even more otherworldly. Her height, nearly 7 feet, made her duck slightly under doorways, and the blue tint of her skin contrasted sharply with the utilitarian gray of the station's interior. She held her bundle close, amber eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Sit here," Eris directed, indicating a medical examination table in the small infirmary. It was designed for human physiology, but it would have to do. "Let me see the child." She hesitated, protective instincts warring with necessity. Finally, with trembling hands, she unwrapped the bundle. The infant Kalan was tiny, much smaller than Eris expected. Its skin was a paler blue than its mother's, almost translucent in places, showing a complex network of darker blue veins underneath. Its eyes, large like all Kalans but cloudy and unfocused, opened briefly at the change in temperature, then closed again. The infant's chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. Eris activated his diagnostic scanner, hoping the device calibrated for human biology would provide at least some useful information. The readings were difficult to interpret, but confirmed what was visibly obvious: severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia. The tiny body was shutting down. "Your name?" Eris asked, already moving to the supply cabinets, pulling out thermal blankets and hydration equipment. "Lyra," she answered, watching his every movement with intensity. "My child is Kale. I'm Dr. Eris Thorne." He wrapped the infant in a thermal blanket, noting how the small being barely registered on the weight sensors. "Lyra, I need to know, what do Kalan infants eat besides mother's milk? Any plant derivatives? Proteins?" She shook her head slowly. "Mother's only until—" She made a gesture with her hand, indicating growth. "But now nothing grows. Nothing lives." Her voice caught. Other mothers mix water with sap from gala tree. But gala tree's all dead now. Eris's mind raced through his xenobiology training. Similar evolutionary paths often led to similar biological needs. The Kalans were mammals, or the closest equivalent this world had produced. Their biochemistry, while alien, shared basic building blocks with Earth life. "I'm going to try something," he said, accessing the station's food processor. "A nutrient solution. I can't promise it will work, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. There was no need to articulate what would happen if it didn't work. The baby would die, as countless others on this planet already had. While the processor worked, Eris prepared a small feeding tube and warmer for the infant. Lyra watched him with a mixture of apprehension and fragile hope. "You break your laws," she said softly. "To help us." Eris's hands stilled for a moment. "Yes," he acknowledged, not looking at her. "Why?" A simple question with a complicated answer. Images flashed through his mind. The burnt village on Proxima B, the inquiry, Sarah walking away for the last time, the years of isolation he'd chosen as penance. "Because some laws should be broken," he finally said, as the processor chimed completion. The next hours were tense and exhausting. The first feeding was nerve-wracking. The solution had to be administered drop by drop via the tube, as Kale was too weak to suckle. Lyra held her child while Eris controlled the flow, both of them watching for any signs of adverse reaction. The Kalan physiology might reject the Earth-derived nutrients entirely, but gradually, miraculously, the tiny chest began to rise and fall with stronger breaths. A small hand flexed. Kale's eyes, a lighter amber than his mother's, opened and seemed to focus, if only briefly. Eris adjusted the thermal settings, creating a makeshift incubator from medical equipment never designed for this purpose. The station's computer registered the unusual power distribution but didn't trigger any alarms. Small mercies. Through the night, they took turns monitoring Kale. During one of her rest periods, Lyra began to speak haltingly about the final days of her settlement. Last season, water turned bad. Animals died first, then plants. The elder said it was the great cycle, that it had happened before long ago. She traced a pattern on the blanket covering her child. But this time, different. This time, no rain came. No new growth. My mate, Kale's father, went with others to find water beyond the great hills. They never returned. She described how the remaining Kalens had gradually dispersed or died, how she had been among the last to leave the settlement, hoping against hope that her mate would return. I heard stories of human station, she continued. Some said humans brought the death to our world. Others said humans had great medicine, great machines. She looked directly at Eris. I had nowhere else. Eris listened, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't correct her misconceptions about human capabilities or explain that his station was merely documenting her world's death, not preventing it. Such truths seemed unnecessarily cruel. Instead, he found himself sharing fragments of his own story. His career as a xenobiologist, his earlier idealism, his posting to Proxima B, where he made the fateful decision to provide medical aid to a village suffering from a mysterious illness. He didn't tell her how that decision had resulted in a devastating cross-contamination event, how his attempted cure had reacted with the local environment to create a toxin that spread through the water table, how he'd been extracted as the villagers began to die. I learned to follow the rules after that, he concluded quietly, checking Kale's vital signs again. The infant had taken another feeding and now slept more peacefully. Lyra's large eyes studied him. So you hide here, watching worlds die. Her bluntness startled him. Put so plainly, his existence seemed suddenly pathetic, a coward's atonement. Yes, he admitted, until tonight. She reached across the medical cradle and touched his hand, her 3 long fingers cool against his skin. Then tonight you begin to live again. She glanced down at her sleeping child. As do we. Dawn brought with it a small victory. Kale had survived the night, his vital signs stabilizing. The makeshift formula seemed to be providing at least basic nutrition without toxic effects. Eris refined a mixture based on his observations, adding more complex proteins and carbohydrates that mimicked what he could determine of Kalan biochemistry from his limited research materials. Lyra had slept fitfully on a cot Eris had set up next to the incubator. Now she sat up, her long limbs folding gracefully as she moved to check on Kale. A soft sound, something between a hum and a purr, emerged from her throat as she gently stroked the infant's forehead with one finger. A blessing song, she explained, seeing Eris's curious expression. For new days. The domesticity of the moment struck Eris with unexpected force. His station, so long a place of solitude and scientific detachment, had transformed overnight into something else entirely. A sanctuary, a nursery, perhaps even a home of sorts. The thought both warmed and terrified him. His musing was interrupted by a warning beep from the communications console. His heart sank as he checked the notification. A scheduled transmission from Earth Control was due in 15 minutes. Routine check-in, perfunctory under normal circumstances, now a looming threat. I need to send a transmission, he told Lyra, trying to keep his voice calm. You and Kale must stay out of sight of the cameras. Can you go to my sleeping quarters? Through that door. She nodded, gathering Kale and the portable warming unit. As she moved toward the indicated door, she asked, Your people would punish you for helping us? Yes, severely. No point in sugarcoating it. Stay quiet, please. When the communication screen lit up with the Earth Core logo, Eris had composed himself into the familiar mask of professional detachment. Commander Lowell's face appeared, as stern and bureaucratic as ever. Station K, 7, routine check-in, Lowell said. Report status, Dr. Thorne. Eris recited the prepared data, atmospheric readings, geological activity, all carefully selected to show a gradual continuation of Kalen's decline, nothing unusual or worthy of special attention. Indigenous population? Lowell asked, as he always did. No confirmed sightings in the observation zone for 17 days. Eris answered truthfully, if misleadingly. Technically, Lyra had come to him, not into his designated observation zone. Very well. Continue monitoring protocol. Next check-in scheduled for... Lowell paused, looking at something off-screen. His expression changed subtly. Dr. Thorne, our systems are showing unusual power consumption patterns at your station over the past 12 hours, particularly in your medical bay. Explain. Eris's mind raced. Equipment calibration and sterilization, he said, the lie coming more easily than he expected. The dust storms have been particularly bad. Some of my equipment was showing contamination. Lowell studied him for a moment, then nodded. Submit a full report on the contamination issue. And Dr. Thorne, remember that your posting there is probationary. After Proxima B, you're fortunate to be in the field at all. I'm aware, Commander. Thank you for the reminder. When the screen went dark, Eris released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The lie had worked for now, but increased scrutiny was the last thing he needed. He found Lyra sitting on the edge of his bed, softly singing to Kale. She looked up as he entered. Your leader suspects? Maybe. Not specifically, but it complicates things. He checked the infant, pleased to see more color in the tiny face. We need to be more careful with power usage, and I'll have to create false reports to cover our tracks. You risk much, Lyra observed. Eris met her gaze. Less than you did, coming here. The next days fell into a rhythm of care and caution. Kale responded well to the refined formula, gaining strength visibly with each feeding. Eris modified the station's environmental controls to better suit Kalen physiology, slightly higher humidity, slightly lower oxygen levels, carefully balancing the needs of his guests with the need to avoid detection. Communication between them improved as well. Lyra's grasp of English expanded rapidly, and Eris began to learn simple phrases in the musical Kalen language. Their conversations grew less halting, more substantive, revealing the complex person behind the desperate mother who had appeared at his door. He learned that she had been a keeper of histories in her settlement, responsible for maintaining the oral traditions and star knowledge of her people. She described elaborate ceremonies tracking the movements of celestial bodies, ancient stories explaining the origins of Kalen life, complex familial structures now fractured by ecological collapse. In turn, Eris shared more about Earth, about human cultures and sciences. He found himself speaking more in these few days than he had in years, rediscovering the joy of intellectual exchange, of being truly heard. One evening, as they sat watching Kale sleep peacefully in his improvised crib, Lyra asked the question Eris had been dreading. When your supplies for Kale's food are gone, what then? It was the future neither wanted to contemplate. The station's resources were finite, designed to support one human for a predetermined mission duration. Already, Eris was rationing his own food to extend their supplies. I'm working on synthesizing more, he said, but they both knew it was at best a temporary solution. Perhaps. The station's alarm system blared to life, cutting him off. Red emergency lights pulsed throughout the living quarters. Eris rushed to the control panel, Lyra close behind him. What is it? She asked, clutching Kale protectively. Eris's fingers flew over the controls, accessing sensor readings. Massive dust storm approaching. Category 5. He pulled up external camera feeds, showing an ominous wall of swirling brown and red on the horizon, moving faster than any storm he'd previously recorded. The atmospheric instability is getting worse. This could damage the station's external systems. As if in confirmation, the lights flickered and the environmental system made a worrying, grinding noise. Kale began to cry, a thin wail that tore at Eris's heart. The air filtration, Lyra said, looking at the ventilation ducts. If it fails, she didn't need to finish. The outside atmosphere was now toxic enough that prolonged exposure would be deadly to both humans and Kalens, especially an infant. We need to get to the emergency bunker, Eris decided. It has its own power and air supply. He began gathering essential supplies, Kale's formula, medical equipment, water. The storm hit with a force that made the entire station shudder. Dust particles found their way through microscopic gaps in the external structure, creating a fine haze in the air despite the filtration system's laboring efforts. They sealed themselves in the emergency bunker, a reinforced room designed as a last resort in case of catastrophic environmental events, just as the main power failed. In the dim emergency lighting, Eris monitored the backup systems while Lyra tried to calm Kale. The infant's breathing had become labored, affected by the change in air quality before they had reached the bunker. He needs oxygen, Eris said, preparing a small mask from the emergency medical kit. Here, hold this near his face, not touching, just so he breathes the enriched air. Lyra did as instructed, her own breathing quick with worry. Will the storm pass soon? Hours, maybe a day, Eris answered, checking the external sensors that still functioned. The bigger concern is the damage it might cause. If the main environmental system fails completely, the unspoken truth hung between them. Without functioning life support, the station would become uninhabitable. As they huddled in the bunker, the howling of the storm outside created an eerie backdrop to their conversation. To distract themselves from the danger, they spoke of their childhoods. Lyra's among the towering spiral structures of her settlement, where young Kalins learned to climb almost before they could walk. Eris's in the biodomes of Mars Colony, where every resource was precious and strictly controlled. "We're not so different," Lyra observed, as Kale finally drifted to sleep against her chest. "Both children of harsh worlds." Eris nodded, struck by the truth of it. "Both last of our kind, in a way. You among your people, me." He trailed off, realizing how isolated he had become, by choice and by circumstance. "Not last," Lyra corrected gently, looking down at Kale. "Not anymore." The simple statement carried such weight that Eris found himself overwhelmed with unexpected emotion. He turned away, ostensibly to check the equipment, but really to hide the moisture in his eyes. When had he last cried? Before Sarah left? Before Proxima B? He couldn't remember. "I wasn't always like this," he said after regaining his composure. "Cold. Distant. I used to believe in connection, in reaching out across differences." He adjusted a setting on the oxygen regulator. "I was part of First Contact Team once. We made peaceful connections with 3 different sentient species. I believed in what we were doing, sharing knowledge, helping where we could." "What changed you?" Lyra asked. Eris was silent for a long moment. "Proxima B," he finally said. "A settlement, there was suffering from a disease. Against protocol, I offered medical aid." His hands stilled on the controls. "The treatment interacted with their biochemistry in ways I hadn't predicted. It spread through their water, killed hundreds." The familiar weight of guilt pressed on his chest. "After that, I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. The rules existed for a reason, so I followed them, religiously. Until us," Lyra said softly. "Until you," he agreed. The storm raged for nearly 20 hours, battering the station with unprecedented fury. When it finally subsided, they emerged from the bunker to find the interior of the station coated with fine dust that had infiltrated through damaged seals. Worse, the main environmental system was operating at reduced capacity, and 2 of the exterior solar panels had been damaged. Eris worked frantically to repair what he could, but some components were beyond his ability to fix. The station would maintain life support, but at a diminished level. Power would need to be conserved rigorously. As he was assessing the damage to the communications array, a priority alert flashed on the main screen. His heart sank as he read the message from Earth Control. "Attention Station K7. Environmental anomalies detected. Unauthorized life signs indicated. Emergency extraction protocol initiated. Retrieval craft dispatched. Etaveroveta sortios. Secure all research materials for transport. Station will be sterilized post-evacuation as per xenobiological containment protocol. Acknowledgement required." The clinical language couldn't disguise the threat. They knew about Lyra and Kale, and sterilized meant exactly what it sounded like. The station would be purged with radiation or chemicals lethal to any remaining life forms. Eris had seen it done before, on stations where unauthorized biological material had been detected. He stood frozen before the screen, the implications washing over him in waves. They were sending a ship, for him alone. Lyra and Kale would be containment risks to be eliminated. Bad news, Lyra said from behind him. It wasn't a question. She had become attuned to his moods, could read tension in the set of his shoulders. Eris turned, not bothering to hide the message. Lyra read it, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to fear. They will take you away, she said, and kill us. Yes. There was no point in denial or false comfort. Then you must go, she said, straightening to her full height. When a ship comes, tell them we forced you to help us, that we threatened you. What? Eris stared at her. They will believe this, yes? That you were afraid? That you had no choice? She stepped closer, her amber eyes intense. You can live, Eris. Return to your world. The selflessness of her suggestion stunned him. After all she had suffered, all she had fought for, she was offering him an escape route, one that would cost her and Kale their lives. No, he said, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. No, I won't do that. But you must. I must nothing, he interrupted. I've spent 5 years hiding from responsibility, from connection, from life itself. I've used rules as a shield against making hard choices. He took her hands, feeling the slight difference in temperature, the different texture of her skin against his. I won't abandon you and Kale. Not now. Not ever. The conviction in his voice surprised even him. It felt like rediscovering a part of himself long buried, the part that had once believed in something more important than safety, more vital than regulations. Then what will we do? Lyra asked, hope and fear mingling in her voice. Eris looked around the station that had been his prison and refuge for 3 years. Then his gaze fell on the storage compartment where emergency supplies were kept. We run, he said simply. The next hours were a blur of preparation. Eris gathered everything they would need for survival: portable water purifiers, medical supplies, lightweight shelter materials, the components needed to continue producing Kale's formula. He transferred critical research data to a portable unit, not willing to lose years of scientific observations even in their flight. Lyra packed with the efficient focus of someone accustomed to survival under harsh conditions. She modified some of Eris's clothing to better fit her taller frame, created a secure carrier for Kale from medical materials, prepared dried rations and portions suited for their journey. As night fell, Eris faced his final act of rebellion. At the main computer terminal, he initiated a cascading system failure that would corrupt the station's locator beacon. It wouldn't stop the retrieval craft from finding the station, but it would prevent them from immediately tracking where Eris had gone. Next, he deleted all surveillance footage showing Lyra and Kale, replacing it with manufactured data showing him alone, growing increasingly erratic in isolation. They'll think I've gone mad from solitude, he explained to Lyra, that I imagined indigenous contact. It might buy us some time while they investigate the station rather than immediately hunting for us. Where will we go? Lyra asked, securing the last of their supplies in makeshift packs. Eris hesitated. This was the greatest gamble of all. You once mentioned ruins beyond the eastern ridge. Ancient Kalan structures. Lyra nodded. The first dwelling places. From before recorded history. Why there? Because of what you said about them, that they were built into the rock itself, deep underground. If they have intact chambers, they might offer shelter from the environmental toxins. And being stone, they won't appear as heat signatures on scanners. It was a desperate plan, based on legend and hope more than solid information. But it was all they had. Just before dawn, they stood at the station's rear exit, away from the direction the retrieval craft would approach from. Eris wore an atmospheric mask and carried the heavier packs. Lyra had Kale secured to her chest in the improvised carrier, the infant swaddled against the toxic air and wrapped in thermal material. Eris looked back at the station one last time, at the life he was abandoning, the career now irrevocably destroyed, the safety of everything familiar. Then he looked at Lyra, at the trust in her eyes, and at the tiny sleeping form of Kale between them. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Together, they stepped out into the dim light of Kalen's dawn, three figures moving across a desolate landscape, leaving behind the last outpost of Earth's presence on this dying world. The journey was brutal from the first step. The terrain, once likely beautiful with its dramatic rock formations and sweeping plains, had been transformed by ecological collapse into a treacherous maze of dust bowls, crumbling stone, and toxic sinkholes. The air, even through Eris's mask, tasted of metal and decay. They traveled by night when the temperature dropped to bearable levels and sought shelter during the scorching days. Kale, mercifully, seemed to adapt to the rhythm, sleeping during their movement and waking during their rest periods for feeding and care. On the third night, as they picked their way through a ravine that Lyra believed would lead to the ancient ruins, Eris's portable scanner detected movement behind them. "Down," he whispered, pulling Lyra into the shadow of an overhanging rock. They watched in tense silence as a small drone flew overhead, its sensors sweeping the ground below in methodical patterns. "Earth core?" Lyra asked when it had passed. "Yes, probably launched from the retrieval craft." The knot in Eris's stomach tightened. "They're looking for us already. We need to move faster." But faster was a relative concept in their situation. Lyra, though resilient, was still recovering from her near starvation. Kale required frequent stops for feeding and care, and the terrain grew increasingly difficult as they entered the foothills of what had once been a mountain range, now eroded into jagged, unstable formations. During one of their daytime sheltering periods, huddled in the shadow of a massive boulder, Lyra taught Eris a Kalen lullaby as they took turns holding Kale. The melody was haunting, with intervals unlike any human music Eris had heard. He tried to follow along, his human vocal cords struggling with some of the tones, which made Lyra laugh for the first time since he'd met her. The sound was so unexpected, so bright in their grim circumstances, that Eris found himself laughing too. For a moment, improbably, they were just two people sharing a light moment with a child, not refugees fleeing across a dying planet. "What will happen?" Lyra asked later, as they prepared to move on. "If we find the ruins, and they're not as the stories say? If there is no shelter?" Eris checked Kale's vital signs before answering. The infant was doing remarkably well considering the circumstances, adapting to the formula and showing increasing periods of alertness. "Then we'll find another way," he said finally. "There's an old human saying, where there's life, there's hope." He secured the portable medical unit in his pack. "As long as we're alive, we keep looking for solutions." Lyra studied him with those penetrating amber eyes. "You have changed much, Eris Thorn, from a man who would not open his door." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. "I was dead inside that station. Just didn't know it." On the fifth night, they reached the location Lyra's people had described in their ancient stories. At first, Eris felt a crushing disappointment. There was nothing there, just more eroded rock formations, more dust, more desolation. But Lyra moved forward confidently, running her hands along seemingly ordinary rock faces, murmuring words in her native language. "Here," she said finally, indicating a narrow fissure between two towering stone slabs. "The entrance is hidden, protected by the stone guardians." She gestured to the rock formations which, from certain angles, did resemble stylized figures. The fissure was almost too narrow for Eris to pass through with his packs, but he managed by turning sideways. Lyra, with her slender frame, slipped through more easily, keeping Kale close to her chest. Beyond the fissure, the space opened into a passage that sloped downward, disappearing into darkness. Eris activated his portable light, revealing walls carved with intricate designs, mathematical patterns, astronomical charts, and flowing script in a language he'd never seen before. "Ancient Kalen," Lyra explained, tracing the symbols reverently. "From before we took to the surface." Our ancestors lived below ground, emerging only when the sun cooled enough. They followed the passage deeper, the air growing noticeably cooler and, surprisingly, cleaner. Eris checked his atmospheric analyzer and was astonished to see toxin levels dropping the further they descended. After what seemed like an hour of careful progress, the passage opened suddenly into a vast underground chamber. Eris's light couldn't reach all the walls, giving the impression of infinite space stretching into darkness. But what the light did reveal took his breath away. The chamber was an architectural marvel. Soaring columns carved directly from the bedrock supported a ceiling decorated with a precise map of the night sky, as it would have appeared thousands of years ago. Smaller passages led off in multiple directions. And most incredibly, at the center of the chamber, a pool of water gleamed in the light, clear, undisturbed, and by Eris's quick analysis, untainted. "It's a natural aquifer," he whispered, voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Protected from surface contamination by the rock layers. Lyra moved to the water's edge, kneeling to touch it with reverent fingers. "The life well," she said, awe in her voice. "I thought it was only a story, a myth from the ancient songs." Eris continued scanning the chamber, finding more wonders with each sweep of his light. There were signs of intelligent design everywhere. Ventilation shafts that somehow still functioned, bringing in filtered air from the surface, channels that directed the water into smaller pools, and what appeared to be ancient growing areas, living spaces carved into the walls. This place was a self-contained ecosystem, he realized aloud. Your ancestors created a completely sustainable underground habitat. He turned to Lyra, excitement overriding exhaustion. And it's still functioning, at least partially. The water, the air circulation, the basic systems are intact. For the first time since their flight began, real hope bloomed in Lyra's expression. She looked down at Kale, who was awake and looking around with curious eyes, perhaps sensing the change in air quality. "We can stay here," she asked, the question containing so much more than those simple words. Could they survive? Could they build a life? Could they have a future? Eris joined her by the water, setting down his pack with a grateful sigh. He ran his hand through the cool liquid, watching ripples spread outward in perfect concentric circles. "Yes," he said, "we can stay." Over the next days, they explored their newfound sanctuary, discovering its resources and limitations. The main chamber connected to smaller rooms that had clearly once served as living quarters, storage areas, and communal spaces. Some passages had collapsed over the millennia, but many remained accessible. Most crucially, they found evidence that the ancient Kalins had cultivated certain plants in specially designed growing chambers, where light from the surface was channeled down through crystalline formations that still glittered in the ceiling. Some of the growing beds still contained soil, preserved in a stable environment. If we could find seeds or spores. Eris mused, examining the beds with scientific interest. "Perhaps," Lyra said, reaching into a small pouch she had carried throughout their journey. She opened it to reveal a handful of small, dark objects that resembled seeds. "These are from the last surviving gala tree in our settlement. I took them before leaving, though I had little hope for them." Eris stared at the seeds, understanding the significance of what she had done, preserving a piece of her world's life even as she fled its death. It was an act of profound hope in the face of despair, one that humbled him. "We can try to plant them," he said, "and I can analyze their structure to synthesize nutrients they might need." Within a week, they had established a simple but functional living space. Using materials from his packs and items found in the ruins, Eris created a more permanent sleeping area for Kale, improved the formula production setup, and established a basic laboratory for studying the indigenous biology. Lyra applied her knowledge of ancient Kalan practices to identify which water sources were best for drinking, which chambers offered optimal living conditions, and how to read the ventilation patterns to maintain air quality. One evening, as they sat by the central pool sharing a meal of rations supplemented with a nutrient-rich algae Eris had discovered growing in one of the smaller water sources, Lyra asked a question that had clearly been on her mind. Will your people keep looking for us? Eris considered the question carefully. For a while, yes. But Kalen is just one of many worlds under observation. Resources are limited, and eventually they'll consider me a lost cause, either dead or gone native. They'll place the station in automated mode and move on. And then we will be safe as anyone can be on a dying world, he answered honestly. But this place, he gestured to the chamber around them. It's protected from the worst of the surface degradation. And if we could get some of your seeds to grow, establish even a small sustainable food source. He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood the potential. Kale made a soft cooing sound from his sleeping area, drawing both their attention. The infant had improved dramatically since reaching the ruins. His skin had developed a healthier blue tone. His eyes were alert and tracking movement, and he had begun vocalizing in the ways typical of Kalen infants, according to Lyra. He is thriving, Lyra said softly, maternal pride evident in her voice. Because of you. Because of us. Eris corrected. Because we refused to give up. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, deeper than gratitude, more complex than friendship. Neither of them was ready to name it, but its presence was undeniable. Eris broke the moment by checking his scanner, a habit he maintained even though they had seen no signs of pursuit for days. To his shock, the device showed a signal, faint but distinct, moving on the surface above them. Someone's up there, he said, tension returning to his voice, moving in a search pattern. They extinguished their light source immediately, plunging the chamber into darkness broken only by the dim bioluminescence of certain mineral formations in the walls, a feature they had discovered was brightest when all artificial light was removed. In the ghostly blue glow, Eris and Lyra moved silently to where Kale slept, positioning themselves protectively near him. The scanner continued to show movement, gradually coming closer to the area above their hidden sanctuary. If they have deep scanning equipment, Eris whispered. Lyra placed a steadying hand on his arm. The Ancient Ones built these chambers to hide from the sun's rage. The stones contain minerals that scatter scanning signals. Her certainty was comforting, though Eris wondered if it was based on knowledge or faith in her ancestors' ingenuity. They remained motionless, barely breathing, as the signal circled overhead. Kale, as if sensing the tension, stayed remarkably quiet, only making occasional soft movements in his sleep. After what seemed an eternity, the signal began to move away. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 30. Finally, the scanner showed no movement within its range. They're gone, Eris said, allowing himself to exhale fully. For now. But they will return? Lyra asked. Probably. Standard search protocol is to cover an area multiple times from different approaches. He ran a hand through his hair, now noticeably longer than the regulation cut he'd maintained at the station. But if they don't detect anything, eventually they'll move on to more promising areas. That night, as Lyra slept with Kale nestled against her, Eris remained awake, thinking about what the future might hold. The sanctuary they had found was secure for now, but long-term survival would require more than just hiding. They would need to establish a sustainable food source, ensure continued water purification, perhaps find ways to heal some of the damage to Kalen's ecology, at least locally. It was an overwhelming prospect, but strangely, Eris felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. He had spent so long recording death that participating in the preservation of life, even on this small scale, felt like redemption. The following weeks brought both progress and challenges. 3 of Lyra's gala seeds germinated in the ancient growing beds, sending up pale shoots that strengthened daily under the channeled light. Eris studied the algae growing in the secondary pools, finding it nutritionally viable as a supplement to their dwindling ration supplies. Kale continued to develop, becoming more active and responsive every day. But the searches continued on the surface, sometimes coming disturbingly close to their hidden entrance. Each time, they would extinguish their lights and wait in tense silence. Eris monitoring the scanner, Lyra holding Kale close. During one such alert, when the signal had lingered almost directly above them for over an hour, Kale began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable with the disruption to his routine. Lyra tried everything to quiet him, but the infant's distress mounted toward the inevitable crying that would echo in the stone chamber. In desperation, Eris acted on instinct, taking Kale from Lyra and cradling him against his chest. He began to hum the Kaelin lullaby Lyra had taught him, his deeper voice producing vibrations that seemed to soothe the infant. Kale's distress ebbed as Eris continued the melancholy tune, eventually drifting back to sleep. When the danger had passed and light was restored, Eris found Lyra watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "What?" he asked quietly, still holding the sleeping infant. "He knows you as family now," she said simply. "As father." The word struck Eris with unexpected force. Father, a role he had never anticipated, particularly not to a child of another species, on a planet far from his own. Yet the rightness of it settled in his chest like a physical warmth. "Is that acceptable?" he asked, suddenly aware of cultural boundaries he might be crossing. Lyra stepped closer, placing one hand over his where it supported Kale's small body. "Among my people, family is made by choice as much as by birth. One who gives life, who protects, who teaches, this is parent." Her amber eyes held his with unwavering certainty. "You have done these things." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what they had become together, not just survivors or allies, but a family forged in the crucible of crisis and choice. 2 months after their arrival at the ruins, Eris ventured to the surface for the first time since the searches had stopped. Heavily protected against the toxic atmosphere, he emerged cautiously through the hidden fissure, scanner sweeping for any sign of Earth core presence. The landscape remained desolate, but his scientific eye noted subtle changes. The last season's dust storms had reshaped the terrain, exposed new rock formations, deposited minerals and patterns that might, over centuries, lead to new soil development. Kaelin was not healing, exactly, but changing, adapting to its new reality. Life, as he had learned repeatedly on countless worlds, found ways to persist. He collected samples, took readings, and most importantly, adjusted the small solar collector he had positioned at the entrance during his previous brief excursion. The device, camouflaged to match the surrounding stone, provided crucial power for their essential equipment below. When he returned to the underground sanctuary, he found Lyra tending to the growing gala plants, which now stood nearly knee-high, their silvery leaves unfurling in the channeled light. Kale was awake in his improved cradle, waving his arms at the bioluminescent patterns Lyra had arranged on the ceiling above him. "The surface?" Lyra asked, looking up from her work. "No signs of search activity for at least several weeks, based on the dust patterns," Eris reported. "I think they moved on, classified me as lost or dead." He knelt beside the growing beds, examining the plants with approval. "These are doing remarkably well. They remember their purpose," Lyra said, in the somewhat mystical way she sometimes referred to the natural world. "To grow, to provide, to continue." Eris had come to appreciate this perspective, so different from his scientific materialism, yet complementary to it in unexpected ways. "I've been analyzing the sap production," he said. "When they're mature enough, we might be able to create a more natural formula for kale, closer to what Kaelin infants traditionally consume." Lyra's face lit with hope at this possibility. Though Kale thrived on the synthetic formula, both of them wanted to connect him to his heritage in every possible way. Later, as they shared a meal by the central pool, their diet now enhanced by the edible algae and small protein cultures Eris had managed to develop, they allowed themselves to speak more concretely about the future than they had before. If the gala trees mature fully, their seeds could be planted in other chambers, Lyra suggested. And perhaps other plants could be found on the surface, those adapting to the changes. "And I've been thinking about the water circulation system," Eris added. "The ancients designed it brilliantly. With some minor adjustments, we could expand it to support more growing areas." They spoke of possibilities that stretched months and years ahead, improvements to their living space, educational tools for Kale as he grew, ways to possibly communicate with any other Kalen survivors without alerting Earth authorities. The conversation had an intimacy and domesticity that would have been unimaginable to either of them not so long ago. As Kale dozed off and they prepared for their own rest period, Lyra asked Eris a question that took him by surprise. "Do you regret it? Leaving your world behind?" Eris considered the question seriously, as was his nature. He thought of Earth, of the sterile comfort of the station, of the lonely years stretching before him had he stayed. Then he looked at Lyra, at Kale, at the small but growing sanctuary they were building together. "No," he said finally, with absolute certainty. Not for a moment. Lyra's expression softened. She reached out, her long fingers intertwining with his human ones, so different in form, but matching perfectly in intention. "Nor do I regret coming to your door that night. The best decision I ever made was opening it," Eris replied softly. 1 year after they had fled the observation station, Eris stood in what they now called the garden chamber, marveling at the transformation. 6 gala trees now grew in carefully tended beds, their silvery blue, leaves catching and amplifying the channeled light from above. Between them, smaller plants, propagated from resilient specimens Eris had found during his cautious surface expeditions, created a tapestry of greens, purples, and blues. Kale, now a toddler by Kalen standards, wobbled among the plants on unsteady legs, supervised carefully by Lyra. His happy vocalizations, a mix of Kalen sounds and simplified English words, echoed in the chamber. He had his mother's amber eyes and slender build, but displayed a curiosity and methodical exploration pattern that Lyra often claimed came from his adoptive human father. They had not seen any sign of Earth core presence for months. The automated observation systems were likely still functioning, recording the continued ecological decline of the planet's surface. But no human had come looking for the rogue xenobiologist who had violated humanity's prime directive. In the quiet moments, Eris sometimes thought about his former life, the colleagues who must have written him off as dead, the disciplinary record that would note his disappearance as final evidence of his unreliability. What would they think if they could see him now? Not merely surviving, but living, not merely observing life, but participating in it. More importantly, what would Sarah think? The woman who had left him after Proxima B, unable to bear his retreat into cold professionalism, his refusal to remain emotionally engaged with the universe around him. She had accused him of hiding behind regulations to avoid the messiness of genuine connection, of real love. She had been right, of course, and it had taken the desperate plea of an alien mother at his door to make him see it. "Eris," Lyra called, interrupting his thoughts. "Come see." He joined them by the largest gala tree, where Kale was pointing excitedly at a small protrusion on one of the lower branches. Eris leaned closer, examining the formation. It was unmistakable, the beginnings of a fruit bud, the first produced by any of their trees. "Remarkable," he said, scientific wonder mingling with personal joy. "Ahead of schedule, based on your descriptions." "The trees respond to care, to purpose," Lyra said, lifting Kale into her arms so he could see better. "They know they are needed," Eris nodded, no longer finding such perspectives mystical, but simply a different vocabulary for describing the complex interconnections of living systems. "When it matures, we can try incorporating it into Kale's diet," he said, "and save the seeds for the next planting." The future stretched before them. Not the bleak recording of extinction he had once resigned himself to, but a path of renewal, adaptation, and life persisting against all odds. It would not be easy. Challenges remained, and new ones would arise. The sanctuary they had found was limited, the world outside still hostile and degraded. But they faced it together, neither human nor Kalen alone, but a family of both, something new in the universe. That evening, as Kale slept peacefully and the bioluminescent minerals cast their soft glow across the chamber, Eris and Lyra sat by the central pool, hands intertwined in what had become their customary way of connecting across their biological differences. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, her voice holding the thoughtful tone that Eris had come to recognize as the prelude to an important conversation about what we will teach Kale of the world, of your world and mine. He should know both, Eris replied. All we can share of Kalen culture, history, language, and what I can teach him of Earth and human knowledge. Yes, Lyra agreed. But more important is what we teach him of the future. Not just survival, but possibility. Eris understood what she meant. Kale would grow up in circumstances neither of them had envisioned for their children. On a damaged world, an hidden sanctuary, part of a unique family that bridged two species. How they framed this reality for him would shape his understanding of himself and his place in the universe. We'll teach him that life finds a way, Eris said, echoing words that had become something of a mantra for them. That where there's life, there's hope. That connections between people, between species, between all living things are what matter most. Lyra's amber eyes reflected the soft blue light as she gazed at him. And love, she added softly. We will teach him of love that crosses all boundaries. Yes, Eris agreed, leaning closer to her. But most of all, as their lips met, a gesture that had once seemed impossible across their different physiologies, but now felt as natural as breathing. Eris reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a man who had closed himself off from life to record death, to one who had opened his door to desperate need and found, in doing so, the way back to himself. Outside, on the surface of Kalen, the ecological decline continued its slow, inexorable process. Dust storms came and went, toxins circulated in the dwindling waters, the weak sun shone on an increasingly barren landscape. The automated systems of the abandoned observation station dutifully recorded it all, transmitting data to distant Earth about a world dying by degrees. But beneath the surface, in chambers built by ancient hands for the preservation of their people, something new took root and grew. A garden, a family, a future, not the end of a world, but the beginning of one.